Hello and welcome to this second panel in our Troubling Anniversaries conference. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, or indeed for those of you who weren't able to make out what I was trying to say this morning, I'm Professor Olwen Purdue. I work on Irish social history here at Queen's University Belfast, where I'm also the director of the Centre for Public History. This is the annual conference of the Centre for Public History, and we're absolutely delighted this year to be partnering with the Institute for Historical Research for this year's conference. It's particularly appropriate given the year that this is. This is the Institute's 100th year. It's been doing remarkable work over the past century. And of course, as many of you are aware, this is also This year marks 100 years of Northern Ireland's existence, something that is probably slightly more contentious. I would guess even this day is an appropriate day to be holding this conference, given the contestation around the ceremony to mark the centenary that is happening in Armagh today. So it's good to be able to reflect on the issue of how we deal with difficult pasts. And we do wish you could actually be here in Belfast to join us in person. Sadly, that wasn't possible, but one of the things we've tried to do in this conference is to give you a little bit of a flavour of Belfast and Northern Ireland and to bring you here virtually. And that's something I think this panel will do very well as we explore together some of the opportunities and the challenges represented in curating and engaging public audiences with Northern Ireland's contested past and indeed its contested present. What we want to do today is to take you behind the scenes of the curation of Northern Ireland's past in the Ulster Museum, an institution that had its roots among the liberal intellectual milieu of the early 19th century Belfast, but that came of age in the context of Northern Ireland's early years. It's now one of the 4 museums that make up National Museums NI. I think for many years, and I don't think anyone will contradict me here, it's fair to say that the Ulster Museum was seen as quite a conservative institution, in many ways reluctant to take risks, especially when it came to contentious issues such as the Northern Ireland conflict. This is particularly evident, I think, when the museum opened its first gallery to the Troubles, as it's called, back in the late 2000s. It received a lot of criticism at the time, I think, by trying to offend nobody. You could say it maybe ended up pleasing nobody, but that's something maybe we can come back to later. But in 2018, 20 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, the Ulster Museum opened a new gallery that I think everybody agrees was daring, it was ambitious, and it certainly was prepared to take risks, dealing with the most difficult period in Northern Ireland's past, but doing so, I think, in a way that brings together and opens conversations about the wider social, political and cultural influences that have Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping matters that you'll be very familiar with when it comes to Zoom. But could I ask you just to ensure that you are muted throughout the session? Please do feel free to put your cameras on though, because it's nice for speakers to see who they're speaking to. We'll have presentation now from our 3 panelists, after which we hope to have a bit of a discussion. I'll lead a little bit of a discussion and then leave some time for Q&A, finishing promptly at 5 when we'll be chucked out of the room. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand when we get to the Q&A session, or if you want to pop a question into the chat function, I will do my best to keep an eye on that. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to this panel our 3 speakers from National Museums NI. We have William Blair, who is Director of Collections, Hannah Crowdy, Head of Curatorial, and Karen Logan, Senior Curator of History. So I'm going to hand over to William, Hannah and Karen now, who are going to present to us something of the work they've been doing.
I was just going to say, thank you for your kind introduction, Olwen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on our work on curating conflict, which comes under the broad programme heading of the Troubles and Beyond. If you want to move to the next slide, Hannah. It's over 20 years now since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and Northern Ireland is usually described as a post-conflict society and held up as a positive international case study for conflict resolution. But the conflict has left a difficult and challenging legacy. Northern Ireland is a small place, and every life lost is a personal tragedy for the families concerned. The Troubles is a particularly sensitive area because it involves violence, loss, anger, hurt, and a deep-rooted sense of injustice and bitterness in many different communities across Northern Ireland. And we can't take peace for granted. It's something that we must continue to nurture and build. Now, more than ever, we must look to ourselves in that regard, as international attention has inevitably moved to other conflict situations across the world. And building greater mutual understanding involves dialogue and opening up conversations, however difficult they may be at times. We believe our collection is a unique asset and learning resource that allows us not only to reflect on the past, but also on our shared future. Clearly, the museum isn't an omniscient voice. It's simply an enabler of thought and debate. And we try to encourage people to consider diverse perspectives on history, culture, and society. It isn't easy, and that's why we work with partners who bring additional knowledge, insight, networks, and sensitivity to examine the legacy of the past in ways that help to create a better understanding and a new narrative. But clearly, any new narrative is not necessarily an agreed narrative, and it's not within our ability to provide solutions. But our aim is to find ways to look at the past that help people understand it better and perhaps see a more positive future for this place. And we do believe that the museum should be a natural place for reflection, reassessment, and ultimately, perhaps, reconciliation.
And as museums, we adhere to a number of ethical codes and guidelines in our work as a standard, but particularly for this type of work, there are a number of very particular ethical considerations that come with it, because this is very recent history, it's lived history, it is still contentious, as William has said, and it still leaves us with a very complex legacy today. So some of the issues we must be mindful of when we are collecting, researching, interpreting this history are the lack of consensus. And the quote at the top of this slide is one that we use in our Troubles and Beyond gallery, and we would often use it when we write about our work. And in particular, the line, while we have a shared past, we do not have a shared memory. So it's not just about the lack of consensus about what happened in the past, but it's also about lack of consensus about how we acknowledge that today and how we try and move forward from it. Also with the Troubles, there are many victims and survivors and indeed their families living today, and it's a source of great pain and trauma for them, and that is something we have to be very sensitive to in our work. The image on this slide is one of the portraits from Colin Davidson's Silent Testimony, which is 18 victims of loss through the Troubles. And it's very powerful, emotionally impactful artwork. It's actually currently on display at the Ulster Museum at the moment. But in showing such an artwork, we are aware of the effects of it on the people that are directly involved, the sitters, but also the people that will visit it. So we feel like a strong ethical responsibility that we undertake training for our staff, and we have that from WAVE, who represent victims and survivors, and that we ensure that there's support in place for both staff and visitors if they need it. We're also very conscious of the legacy issues, and you only need to engage with the media on a daily basis almost to understand why these legacy issues are so pertinent and still so contentious today. We also have considerable responsibilities in terms of good relations. It's really important that even unwittingly, we don't do anything to foster further discord, and instead that we promote mutual respect, tolerance, and understanding. And then there are sensitivities that come with being a museum and some of the objects that we hold in our collections. So, for example, objects might in themselves express sectarian views. They might be objects that are associated with people who were murdered or injured. And we have to think very carefully about if and how we collect such material, and if and how we share and interpret it. So Karen will tell us a little bit about what our kind of strengths are of our Troubles and Beyond collection.
Yep, so through the Collecting the Troubles and Beyond project, we've been able to develop a really strong and diverse contemporary collection, and this was the central aim of the project, was to widen the scope of the collection, supported by greater academic and community engagement, in order to enhance our interpretation of our recent past. So it put us in a really strong position the years that we've spent developing the collection through that project. And we've acquired significant bodies of work by photojournalists, large archive from the Northern Ireland Prison Service, for example, and other individuals and collections and archives belonging to them, as well as some key items of historic importance. One example would be the memorandum from the final agreement of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, signed by participants in the talks. So this collection really underpins the Troubles and Beyond exhibition and wider programme, but also related exhibitions. You can see here in the image, Figures Through the Wire, artwork by Geordie Morrow. It was a temporary exhibition in 2018, and you can see Geordie here photographed next to his self-portrait. And it's such a resource to draw on. It offers us enormous potential for further phases of development and also for other collaborative projects.
And speaking of that temporary exhibition, a lot of the work we do is behind the scenes work. Essentially, we're constantly developing the collection. We're constantly researching the collection and the associated subject matter. We're doing lots of consultation and engagement with people, but we've been very mindful that there should be public-facing outputs throughout our process. And that's really important for us in terms of ensuring we involve our audiences in the conversation. And also it gives us an opportunity to test what we're doing and gather feedback on it so that we can learn and develop as we go. So these are kind of four of the major exhibitions and projects we have worked on, although there are many, many more. So the image where you can see a visitor looking at a painting is an exhibition we did called Art of the Troubles, which was back in 2014. And I suppose aside from the early Troubles and Beyond, the early Troubles gallery that Olwen mentioned, this was our first major engagement with the subject matter. And I think it was quite important that we did that through art, because for some people that can be an easier way into the subject matter. It's kind of mediated through the artist's view. And we got an incredible public response to that exhibition. And I think we learned from that, and it gave us confidence as we moved on. Below it, you can see Colin Davidson's Silent Testimony, which I've already mentioned. It was first displayed at the Ulster Museum in 2015, and it's on display again at the moment. We think it's a particularly important exhibition to show in this centenary year, because we have to consider what's happened in the last 100 years here and how that has impacted on the lives of people through the conflict. And again, that legacy today, and thinking about that in the context of this centenary, which is quite problematic in many ways. Next to that, it's a project we worked on with an academic from Nottingham Trent University, Voices of 68, and it was looking at that pivotal year which is on a global scale, but looking particularly at what happened here in Northern Ireland, and interviewing some of the different protagonists involved. And you can see two of them there, Anne Devlin and Judith Jennings, when we launched the exhibition at the Ulster Museum. And then above that is our Troubles and Beyond gallery, which, as Olwyn said, opened in 2018 as we're marking the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's completely transformed how we tell this story. It's very object rich. It's been quite a collaborative process in how we've put it together. It's designed to be very flexible and responsive as our work progresses. So we hope it's a much better platform for helping people to understand this history. And one of the things that's really key to us is that it's called the Troubles and Beyond, and that is beyond in two ways. It's beyond in that it goes beyond 1998. It's not trying to claim that the Troubles ended then and that we're not still living with the legacy today. But it's also beyond because it doesn't look purely at conflict. It looks at what life was like here at the time and all the different experiences people have had from living here, again, right up to the present day. And this is the way we work essentially on the Troubles and Beyond, and indeed much of our work. So we are constantly developing the collection. So for that, it particularly means new acquisitions, further building the collection that Karen has talked about, filling any gaps, trying to ensure that people are represented in our collection, that we have a good scope of the events that people want to see covered. Interpretive planning, so that might be exhibitions, as we've seen. We also have programs we would run in terms of events. We also have activity online. We have educational programs. Again, just thinking of different ways to involve people and bring this history to them. Consultation and engagement. This kind of work, there's absolutely no way we could do it on our own. It affects so many people and there's so much expertise outside of the museum. So we're constantly working with people and involving them in our practice. And then evaluation and review, because we continue to learn, we continue to develop, and we feed that into everything we do going forward. So throughout our work, we have been really conscious to talk to people and, as I say, get that feedback, do the evaluation. And what we did last year was we tried to bring that together in a formal evaluation, and we had an external evaluator who worked on that with us. And what we did as part of that process, we analysed all the visitor feedback we'd received to date for different aspects of the work. And we also had conversations with our own staff and with a number of important stakeholders outside of the museum. And we were really kind of looking at what people thought of what we'd done, what they felt the successes had been, and also where we should go next with this work. So to summarise the outcomes, people are engaging more deeply, and in particular, this was because people were having very emotional responses to our work, and some of the comments they were making suggest shifting attitudes and values. So it's not just that they're visiting and they go away and they don't think about it again. It is affecting people, and let's say encouraging them to think and to engage. And also the work we're doing, it's providing quite an important platform for dialogue, people are telling us. It's also helping them gain new perspectives in terms of understanding other views and experiences, challenging perceptions people may have, and furthering their understanding. And a new approach to partnerships, engagement and co-production has been unlocked. Very much our work is about relinquishing control from the museum, this idea that this is a shared history and it's a shared endeavour, what we do in the museum and what we do with our collections. So what happens next? One of the things we always want to explain to people is just because we have the new gallery, that doesn't mean that's it with our work. In fact, if anything, we're gaining even more momentum now with it. It remains a priority area of work for us, and Karen a little bit later will provide a bit more detail on what that means, where we are focusing our energies. But broadly speaking, these are the things we are committing to do. We will be proactive and strategic in how we work with stakeholders, and we're going to use an outcome-based approach to do that, which is something we're using more and more in our work. We want to develop content and embrace a broader narrative. We think we are already starting to achieve that, but we do keep talking to people. We want to ensure that everyone is represented in the museum. And in particular, we want to ensure we include marginalised histories and experiences. We'll expand our partnership working beyond Northern Ireland. The Ulster Museum is a museum with both an international outlook and an international collection. We feel strongly we can learn from others around the world who have dealt with these kind of contested histories and histories of conflict. And we hope they can learn from us as well and our experiences of working in this area. And we will involve more people in our work. This will be about examining the current partnerships that we have, looking at who is present but also who isn't, and how we can bring them into the museum and increase our engagement and develop our audiences. So Karen.
Great. So as Hannah showed in the cycle diagram earlier, as we go through evaluation and review, the cycle repeats as we continue to develop the collection to address areas that need further development, maybe gaps that have been identified. So our focus really has been on community and contemporary history, and that's something that we want to continue with. With my own research fellowship, the Headley Fellowship, I've focused on community history and developed a co-curated exhibition entitled Pandemics Past and Present with a group from East Belfast. And through that, we've established a space for community history at the heart of our permanent gallery, and that display can be repopulated with other content, working with other groups. So that's really an area for development that we will continue. And another thing that was identified as a gap that we've sought to address was material associated with the impact of the Troubles outside of Northern Ireland, and we've collected material recently relating to an attack at Westminster, into the Birmingham Six, and other issues outside of Northern Ireland. In terms of oral histories, we continue to gather those. We most recently interviewed a bus driver who had been hijacked 13 times throughout the Troubles, and he gave an account of his experience and what that was like, working on the front line very often. And one of the buses he drove actually is in our collection and on display at the Ulster Transport Museum, which is another connection. And obviously we're very engaged in inclusion and diversity and collecting around LGBT plus community and history, gender, disability, and ethnicity. And you can see here the photograph. We were awarded the Queer of the Year award. It was the first time that had been given to an institution rather than an individual, and that was for our engagement with LGBT plus community and our work to collect, preserve, and share the positive contribution LGBT plus people make to society. More recently, we've been collecting around Black Lives Matter and working with marginalised communities. So these are really important development areas for us. Also, in terms of research priorities, again, a lot of this has come through the evaluation and review that we've done to date on the Troubles and Beyond programme and identified areas for further development. One of these would be domestic and family life during the Troubles, and that sense of the everyday lived experience, like with the bus driver that I mentioned and others, just living through the Troubles period. The Northern Ireland Prison Service collection is a huge resource for us, and it's really important for us to represent the experiences and perspectives associated with that. And we've done a lot to date representing maybe ex-service personnel and combatants, victims and survivors, but this is one aspect that maybe hasn't had the interpretation that it deserves and the recognition in terms of the prison officers' experience themselves and prisoners and the families and everyone associated with that. The impact and legacy of deindustrialization is an important area that we have discussed covering in relation to Troubles and Beyond, and the Troubles in the context of international conflict. So we've done a lot of work with partners, for example, in Ulster University and conflict textiles, and most recently we've been looking at the issue of enforced disappearance in a global context and through the Following the Footsteps to the Disappeared programme, using objects on display from Zimbabwe, Chile, and Colombia, looking at the experiences of enforced disappearance. And another area we're engaged in is the establishment of the Conflict and Legacy Network with our partners Museum of Free Dairy and Healing Through Remembering. And this is a network for museums and heritage organisations that are specifically covering or have a defined interest in conflict and legacy issues. And it's about getting across the fact that this is a distributed story, working across that network to improve communication and collaboration between the members within it, encouraging cooperation between them and defining a direction of travel. It also will help us to have an increased profile and awareness of the activities associated with conflict and legacy, and potential there as well for advocacy and coming together with one voice. And it helps to connect us with our audiences and share audiences and share resources. And it also ensures an ethical approach. And it's important that all members acknowledge and subscribe to this. And the network will provide guidance, support, and training to those working in this area.
So Hannah's already referred to the fact that really, our work is ongoing, and Karen also. I think sometimes people assume that where we are now is the end of the journey, and really, in reality, the journey, so to speak, never ends. We feel we're very much at the start rather than the end. Everything we do is part of an ongoing learning process, and during lockdown, one of the benefits in some ways of an enforced slowdown, you might say, was that we were able to speed up some of our planning processes, particularly around the development of a new master plan for the Ulster Museum. And our aspirations and our ambitions are very much to build on the work that we've done. We know that we have developed some interesting projects over the years, and really we want to put those absolutely front and center at the core of the museum experience, rather than being maybe temporary in nature. We feel there's an opportunity to significantly expand the Troubles and Beyond gallery within the existing building by using the space to provide additional reflection space, particularly for more challenging content, and to build on our work in relation to co-creation and contemporary collecting. The graphic you see there is an exhibition which has been running for about a year and a half, called Culture Lab, Don't Believe the Stereotype, and that's the kind of project which we really want to, in that sense, hardwire into the mainframe of the museum, rather than it simply being a temporary exhibition. So Hannah, if you want to move on to and next year, on the subject of anniversaries, it is the 50th anniversary of the Ulster Museum itself. The museum was significantly expanded through the addition of a new extension. This has its origins in plans and decisions in the early 1960s, when the museum moved from being under the control of Belfast City Council and was given national status with its own board of trustees, etc. So in that sense, our thinking for next year really is very much to build on what we see as the Ulster Museum's transformational agenda, which is about enhancing its ability to engage more inclusively with diverse audiences. And rather than the Ulster Museum, in a sense, celebrating its own successes with audiences who are already converted, so to speak, we really want to put inclusivity and new audience at the growth at the heart of our plans for next year. We're looking at building a programme that seeks to reflect the diversity of Northern Ireland society by giving individuals and communities a platform, both offline and online, to talk about their perspectives, experiences, or aspirations, ideally where possible using the collection as a stimulus. So in that sense, next year, really our intention is very much not to try to give ourselves a pat on the back, but rather to position the museum in a relevant, inclusive and contemporary light, as a safe and trusted space for both inspiring and difficult conversations. And this is the final slide. And I suppose my final thought would be, the biggest challenge I think we face is shifting perceptions of the museum. And I think that's common within the sector. It's about how do we shift perceptions of museums. people do maybe naturally assume that museums are about the past, and that's true up to a point. But in truth, we're just as concerned, if not more, about the present and the future. And I think the challenge in that sense is how can we ensure that we can critically explore our past in a way that doesn't destabilize our present. How can we, in that sense, use our own agency individually and collectively to make a better future?
Thank you very much, William, Hannah and Karen. That was absolutely brilliant. Just taking us from the past very much into the future. And I'm sure there'll be many questions directed at you now over the next few minutes. But just while people are gathering their thoughts and thinking about questions, one of the things that really struck me is just that sense of a journey that National Museums NI is on, and it becomes really evident, thinking about even in terms of the way in which it deals with the Troubles and how that in itself has changed over the last few decades. And I just wonder maybe if for a moment you could reflect on that and think about that, the journey you've come on so far, in terms of there was a massive change, a massive shift took place in terms of your representation, the museum's representation of the Troubles. And I wondered, could you maybe talk just a little bit about that? Just give us a very brief outline of what the first Troubles Gallery looked like, felt like, and what has changed to allow you now to take a very, very different approach to these very contested issues.
Well, I'll maybe, without wanting to sound too corporate about it, but I think we have been on we are on a sort of a path of transformation as an organization. I know I will sound corporate when I talk about vision, mission, and values, but actually we didn't have, any of those things kind of until relatively recently. And I think it's very important to have a sort of a clear sense of what your role and purpose is and what kind of impact, that you want to make. I think we're moving away in some ways from what was maybe the dominant kind of almost visitor attraction model that, that tended to, that everyone was rather seduced by, when, in recent years, to return maybe to a sort of a more of almost a pure vision, I suppose, or of what really the purpose of a museum is. I do think specifically, having one of our organizational values is be courageous, and I think that's been very helpful touch point for all of us, when we're working on these kind of areas which are, difficult and challenging, and we know we'll, not get it right all the time, far from it. We have to kind of, be prepared to take, criticism as we go along, that's right and proper. It's kind of, we're a public institution, we're here to be scrutinized. But I think, we're a different organization now to what we were even 5 years ago. I think, in terms of, the kind of the profile of staff we have, the sort of the rebuilding that's taken place within curatorial, the emphasis we place on audience development and thinking about audience, and the fact that we have an audience development department, really reflects kind of, a different set of priorities, I suppose. But I do think ultimately, whenever we have any degree of success, it's usually whenever we're trying to be more courageous, and whenever we have our greatest failures, it tends to be when we are, lacking courage. And I think that was probably the case maybe in 2009. I don't think the organization was quite in the right place to be able to tackle that exhibition then. It's not about, I'm not criticizing my predecessors, but I just think we didn't really have the foundation in place and the staff really in place and the resource to be able to even attempt it really. But it was a start, and I suppose, you know, I suppose one good thing was that nobody liked it, you know, and that at least it was a nice even baseline to build on. Be worse if you got a round of applause from one section of society and were roundly booed by another, you know. But I think everybody was underwhelmed by the 2009 exhibition. So, but it was a start, and I think that's still important. You know, you've got to start somewhere.
I mean, it's interesting what you say about being courageous and actually taking the bull by the horns in many ways. I was really struck back when the poppies, anyone who's seen our conference paperwork will be familiar with that image of the poppies from the Tower of London cascading down the front of the Ulster Museum. That was a dramatic moment. I mean, it looked dramatic, but apart from that, within Northern Irish context, the poppy is very much a contested symbol. So, I mean, that was an incredible step to take at that point. And I'd just be interested to hear what your thoughts were on that, the decision to accept the installation, and how you navigated some of the very contested representations that were there. I mean, I'll never forget sitting in a meeting and the Twitter storm that just hit the world whenever it was launched. It certainly wasn't without controversy. So, you know, how did you navigate something that was both controversial and also moving and quite traumatic in itself?
I don't mind taking that as a start if others want to chip in. It wasn't an easy one, I will admit that, and we had a lot of consideration about whether it was the right thing for us to be doing. But that came in 2017, so that was after Art of the Troubles, it was after Silent Testimony, it was before the new gallery opened to the public, but when a lot of that work was taking place. And I think we had become much more confident as an organisation, and we do see our role very much as being a shared space, but also a safe space where people can have quite difficult conversations and engage with difficult issues. And arguably there aren't that many public spaces in Northern Ireland that do have that role in quite the way that we do. So we felt it was kind of our responsibility to take that artwork and open up the conversation. We thought it was interesting that we're a museum of art, history and natural science, and actually you could come at the poppies through those different subject disciplines, and we tried to do that. We tried to talk about it as an artwork, which it was, and so again linking back to a lot of the work we've done around Art of the Troubles. We worked with different community groups and brought them in to see the Troubles, the poppies, and talked about that with them and engaged them in different programs and events. And we again collected a lot of feedback, and there were very negative comments, but in the main it was positive. And I think that's one of the things we've learned, that you have to kind of be open to criticism, and it's always going to happen. And in some ways that's better than being our original Troubles gallery, very bland, and it didn't affect people at all. And I think you can learn a lot from that. So I suppose coming back to what William said, it's about being courageous, not being afraid to do these things. And sometimes it might go well, sometimes it might not. Overall, I think the poppies did go well. I think it proved a great talking point for people. It was a way for people to engage with very difficult and contentious issues. And again, that's our role as the Ulster Museum. We should be doing that.
The only thing I would add is just, I think, fundamentally, what made it possible for us to, to host the installation was the public programming we built around it. In essence, because we saw it as an opportunity to kind of open up a conversation and debate around symbols. And, some of the events, linked to the program were really interesting. And in terms of the diverse perspectives that were brought into that kind of discourse, you might say. And, we did we were quite careful in terms of how we, the planning. We consulted with various stakeholders as well in advance, just to take soundings in terms of what the potential reception might be, including Republican representatives. So it's something that we kind of planned quite carefully. And I think the key was really the programming that we built around it and using it as an opportunity to have a debate, have a discussion about the power and continued relevance of symbols in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and I think that sort of also shows the way in which you're sort of progressing through that, starting with the art work that you were bringing in, going on to the pubbies, and then opening the Troubles and Beyond gallery itself. Karen, can I ask you a quick question? I know there's questions in the chat, so I don't want to dominate completely, but the one thing I would like to ask you is specifically about the collection of the Troubles and Beyond gallery. I mean, if we were meeting in person here, one of the things we would have built into the conference programme would have been a walk around the gallery, which would have been wonderful. But in the absence of that, could you maybe talk us through a couple of what you would see as some of the most interesting objects or important objects that you have in that collection, and why you think they're important, or what is it about them that you think is particularly interesting?
Sure. I would say it's quite difficult to select between them because of the range of material. We were quite fortunate in the range of material that came forward and the different routes that we took towards acquiring it, in terms of going out to the public and inviting maybe like individual and really personal contributions from somebody maybe affected by the Troubles, which is powerful in its own way, against something that we maybe acquired through purchase or a deliberate acquisition of a choice of something maybe sort of more significant, like the memorandum that I mentioned, which is a really historic document and it's signed by participants in the talk. So there are objects like that. Their significance is slightly different. For myself personally, working with and being involved with a lot of the individuals that came forward, a lot of those would connect me, and I obviously haven't spent time with them and connected to their stories and their experiences. There's obviously very personal and poignant objects within that in terms of what came forward. So yeah, it's sort of a range. And again, there was things that just came through by loan. So like there's a wreath that a gentleman lent to us that he laid as a member of the BB at Enniskillen, and he recovered it from the wreckage. He felt it was disrespectful to leave it among the debris, and he actually recovered it, but that wasn't something that he wanted to donate. It was something that it's on loan to us. So there's various different routes into how we acquired and collected this material. And yeah, there's so many stories within it. Those are just a few examples.
Thanks for that, Karen. Yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful to be able to take you all to see it, because it is quite an incredible exhibition. I'm looking at the questions now, and there's a few questions starting to come in now. Sandra has asked, she said, thanks to the Ulster Museum team, how does your collection development plan address the huge gaps of art of the Troubles in your permanent collection? It's noticeable that your temporary exhibitions on the Troubles have relied heavily on other collections, such as the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. Has the museum not missed out on acquiring important works made during the Troubles?
I would, well, I'm very pleased to say that actually we don't have huge gaps anymore. Once upon a time we did. And we have been very proactive with our collections development policy, ensuring that it is much more of a priority for us to collect art around the Troubles. And I think more broadly, the way we think about collecting now, we would have kind of overarching collection themes, such as ensuring the equality and diversity and representativeness of our collections. We would have contemporary collecting to ensure our collections are relevant, and those are things we just wouldn't have focused on in the past. And Art of the Troubles we have been collecting really actively over the last few years. The National Lottery Heritage Fund project, Collecting the Troubles and Beyond, helped us to acquire some really significant artworks for the collection. So our senior curator of art has been working very systematically, looking at where the gaps are and ensuring that all the key artists are represented. And the beyond aspect is still as relevant for art as it is for history. So we have really good working relationships with the artists today. So we continue to develop that collection. And back when we did Art of the Troubles in 2014, yes, we were indeed reliant on loans from Wolverhampton Art Gallery and the Imperial War Museum. Now, it is fair to say that we have the best Troubles art collection in the UK because we have built it up so significantly. And actually, we are looking at probably in 2014, which will be 10 years on from 2024, which will be 10 years on from the Art of the Troubles exhibition. How do we mark that, and how do we show people the extent of the collection today, and reflect again on what's changed in the 10 years and how artists have been responding to the conflict?
Okay, that's really interesting. It's great to see that that is actually building up. Another question that focuses on ways in which the museum is building collections is from C. Murray. And it says that was tremendous and inspiring, how you've gone about this and what you continue to do. And they ask if when you've collected oral testimonies around the Troubles, as I know you have been working on, have you had people willing to go on record, but then decided against it at the last minute, perhaps due to sensitivity of the content? And also, do people wish to give testimony, but then remain anonymous? So does somebody want to maybe talk a little bit about the oral history collection and some of the issues around that?
Sure. With the oral history collection, the answer would be no. Anybody that has come forward has been happy to go ahead and be recorded and have their testimony used as part of the collection. What we did have was one of the individuals who came forward to give us a personal testimony that's a written testimony that's displayed in Troubles Beyond. They did request to remain anonymous, and it was a nurse, and we used a nurse's watch to represent her. She's not identified. And that came through, I think it was in response to the press release around the engagement we were doing in this project. And she just called me up one day and was like, look, as a curator, working on this, I want you to know this perspective and hear my account, but she didn't want to be identified. So her story's included anonymously, but that's the only one I can think of so far.
Okay, thanks then. Caitlin has asked, sort of moving away, a slightly different aspect of the Troubles Museum, the Troubles and Beyond Gallery, and she asks about this concept that's current at the minute, the idea of a Troubles Museum dedicated to the Northern Ireland conflict. Caitlin refers to an article I wrote earlier in this year, in which apparently I said that museums are not neutral spaces, and I think that's a really, really interesting point, and maybe something you want to think about. And Caitlin asked, do your exhibitions then, have they laid the groundwork for an entire museum dedicated to the conflict? Or would that be something that you think would be too difficult to have a permanent museum dedicated to the conflict in the public space?
Well, I think it's true. We're not, I certainly agree with the idea that we're not neutral spaces. I think we're shared spaces, but I think our ethical responsibilities mean, we're not neutral in the sense that, we're not neutral when it comes to issues around sectarianism. We're not neutral on racism. We actually are, I think you have to take a stand on those kind of issues, So in that sense, there is a difference, I think, between being, neutral and being a sort of a shared space. I think our values in themselves are not neutral values. They're kind of progressive values. I suppose it's an interesting question. I think, we do feel that there's certain features with the Ulster Museum that are helpful in terms of being able to explore, our recent conflict. The fact that, it sits within the context of a suite of history galleries, which allows context and perspective, I think is really important. I think the fact that we also have, art galleries that allow for other ways of considering and exploring the conflict and its legacy, I think are all kind of strengths that are very distinctive to the Ulster Museum. I think sometimes, we tend to feel, that, it's not corporately, that really the Troubles is a distributed story and no one owns it. And that's why we feel it's important to be working with other organizations and other institutions, other museums within Northern Ireland, within Ireland as a whole, through the network, because I do think it's that to me is a more effective way of actually allowing for those different perspectives to be represented. I think also, there is a certain, developing a new museum is not easy. There's actually, museums are quite complex. It's quite, we're continually challenged by trying to run the museums that we do. We're also in a situation, so we have a situation where the cultural sector as a whole is coming out of its kind of the greatest crisis we've ever faced. So I think there is an argument, an alternative argument that might look at kind of strengthening, the infrastructure of organizations that are already working in this space, and maybe moving away from the notion that, the answer is a shiny new building. I think that's not, personally, I think there are issues around sustainability which have to be considered, and any new proposal for any kind of, new cultural kind of center really needs to be grounded in the context of, and tested against, sustainability. Is there a business case? Has it been actually kind of really thought through? We have to make a very strong business case, a really strong investment case for our ambitions. And I think that discipline applies to everybody else who may have ambitions to do something themselves.
There's a question just maybe follow on quite nicely from that idea of the role of a museum and what's the purpose and what are some of the challenges and issues around a museum. Katie, who's asked, just says thank you so much for your presentation, and asks if the Ulster Museum team sees the museum's role as being proactive or reactive as it seeks to interpret sensitive and contested histories. Really interesting point there, and I wonder, does somebody want to reflect on that a little bit in terms of, are you being proactive in terms of how you build your collections, in terms of how you deal with sensitive issues, or do you react to certain sets of circumstances? Katie, I hope I've reflected your question accurately there.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and maybe others want to add into it. I would say proactive, and I would say because of the way we have approached contemporary collecting and being really at the front of that, and also, as William was saying earlier, about the vision just within the organization, that it's telling the stories of our past, yes, but it's also challenging our present and shaping our future. I think that gives us a real remit to actually be quite proactive in terms of, yes, challenging some of these perspectives and perceptions and curating them quite critically in terms of how we work with academics and present and encourage critical responses to some of these issues. And I think even in terms of shaping our future and the work that we can do working with groups in the gallery, and somebody else there has asked about silent testimony and people that have been affected, it's that kind of the role that the museum can have as a space for working through some of the legacy of the past issues and attitudes towards some of these sensitive subjects, I suppose, in terms of transforming how people think and react to this, as well as facilitating more discussion around it.
I would say it's really important that we're proactive because, and we touched on in our presentation, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about museums in general and the Ulster Museum in particular, and it's very easy for us to sit there and say, well, of course the museum's for everyone, and of course if we're doing this work, people will understand that and they'll come forward and they'll want to get involved and they'll feel they're represented. But actually that's not the case. We do have to be proactive with it, and we talked about how we were awarded Queer of the Year back in 2018, but actually when we first started talking to people from different LGBT plus organisations, we said, well, of course you're welcome in the museum, and they would say to us, well, we've never felt it because no one's ever said to us we're welcome in the museum. No one ever said to us that that you wanted to represent our history and experiences. And I suppose we've almost been going through a similar thing fairly recently when we've been doing more work with ethnic minority communities who would say, well, we didn't even realise that the museum was here. We didn't think it was for us. What do you mean? You want us to be represented here? And we say, yes, of course we do. But again, you can't assume that. So difficult as much of these histories are, and difficult as the conversations can be, certainly when you're building relationships, I think the onus is on us to be proactive.
I think it's an interesting question in the sense that, part of the test of how proactive we're being is whenever we find we have to be reactive, and it's kind of, you may be in a situation where you feel you're being proactive, but you get a poke with a sharp stick and you suddenly realize you probably need to, accelerate faster into, the development agenda around a particular set of challenges. So, sometimes inevitably we're reactive because, it's, we just find that even though we may feel that we're making, steady kind of progress, that actually maybe the progress isn't visible enough. Maybe we're just we haven't been communicating it, or we haven't been clear enough about it. And then you actually have to react to try to maybe explain yourself better and actually be more, just say, look, we understand these are issues and we are working on it, kind of thing. But you always find in a situation like as a public institution like of the nature of the Ulster Museum, that you're constantly challenged, by the public and by audiences, and that's good. That's actually a constructive challenge. But I think it's important, as I say, that we're guided in that sense by our ethics. Our ethics are kind of a touchstone, and I think it's important, setting your values and that the values are progressive values becomes a sort of an important touch point, for the work that we do, an essential touch point, really.
I think we've time for one last question, and Jenny has put one in here, and I'd like to maybe sort of add to a little bit, if you don't mind, and that's going back. I mean, you've talked about ethics underpinning everything you do, and I think one of the responsibilities ethically is if dealing with traumatic and difficult pasts, is the support that you provide for people who come and see things that may prompt very difficult memories, very difficult emotions. And Jenny's asked here about exhibitions such as Silent Testimony, and we mentioned earlier the Poppies, and obviously the Troubles and Beyond Gallery itself. What kind of support is in place for visitors and also for staff? And could you maybe say a little bit more about the nature of that support and whether that's something that's reflected in National Museum's NI's master plan, dealing with traumatic and difficult issues?
I think with Silent Testimony, just that partnership with WAVE has been absolutely key to the support that we're able to give. So they were involved in the whole development of the exhibition itself, working closely with Colin Davidson, the artist, and then working with us in how we share that exhibition with the public. And they would have considerable experience in how you deal with trauma, and it's experience and expertise that we would admit that we don't have. So that's again where the museum has to recognise often it's expertise outside of our organisation that is significant for us. So when we last had Silent Testimony, WAVE gave training for staff, and indeed they've given training for staff when we opened the Troubles and Beyond gallery as well. This time, I think it's gone even further, and I think has been more meaningful because they've involved some of the sitters whose portraits are there, and they have talked about their own experiences and also what the exhibition means for them. and they have helped our visitor guides to understand like how to look out for if someone's particularly upset by the experience, and what sort of support and contacts to offer them if they are. Even something as simple as we would have had evaluation forms in the exhibition before, and they're anonymous forms and completely optional for anyone who visits. And we found that people have poured their hearts out in those evaluation forms a lot of the time, and found it to be quite a cathartic experience. And they would say things like, I've never told this to anybody, but in response to these artworks, I felt I could. And we feel an incredible responsibility of those, to say they are anonymous, and we're very careful about how we use them. But yes, I think there is considerable learning in all of that for what we would do for the master plan and that kind of idea of a reflection space. It's something we recognise that the kind of fairly small Troubles and Beyond gallery we have at the moment doesn't allow us to do so. The more difficult aspects of the interpretation are what we would call the years of darkness, which are on the ends of the sections, the decade sections in the gallery. And they were very kind of carefully crafted bits of text, working with our academic advisory group, but also with Wave again, who went through it and looked for any particular sensitivities and triggers in there. But although we were careful with that, that gallery isn't a reflective space. We think that is something we need if we're going to deal with the much darker aspects of the conflict.
Thank you. We are well and truly out of time, but I think everybody will agree that that was incredibly thought-provoking, fascinating, and really sensitively approached panel. I would like to thank on your behalf Hannah, Karen and William for an excellent session. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you all for joining us for this.